we don't want a cow to go eat because she's been out of feed for so long that she's hungry and she needs to eat now, right?
Sure.
No, we want cows to be internally hungry. We want her metabolism and basically her body's ability to empty the rumen and clear metabolites quickly so that she has that signaling wherever it's coming from the rumen, from the liver, right, to the brain saying, now it's time to eat again, right? Like, I'm hungry, I got to go eat.
Welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Barry Bradford from Michigan State University, and this week I'm really pleased to be speaking with Dr. Trevor DeVries. Trevor's a professor and the Canada Research Chair in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture from the University of British Columbia in 2001. Immediately following that, he began his graduate studies at UBC, where he received his PhD in 2006. After that, he spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and in 2007, he was appointed as faculty with the University of Guelph in the Department of Animal Biosciences. In that position, Trevor leads a highly productive research program focused on dairy cattle nutrition, management, behavior, and welfare. Trevor, thanks so much for joining us on the Dairy Podcast Show.
Oh, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here with you and have this discussion here today.
So from being kind of on the conference circuit, I know that you're in great demand as a speaker. And I'm just curious, kind of off topic a little bit, to ask you about your experience through COVID. So you were traveling a ton before COVID, March 2020, all those plans got canceled for probably at least a year. Are you kind of back on the normal schedule again? Have you adapted how you approach travel?
Yeah, I would say, travel's back, probably more than I want at this point. Again, we were a little slower, I think, to get kind of back on things here in Canada than in the US, largely related to some of the restrictions and stuff that we had in place here. But
sure.
Especially in the last half year, things have really picked up again, and looking forward to 2023, there's probably committed to more things than I probably should have at this point already. And as you know, sometimes those requests don't stop either. So, but yeah, I guess, it was a good time actually from that perspective. I think many people I talked to realized that when our travel got shut down, that there was some huge benefits associated with that, right? From a personal, mental health, just physical health perspective, right? Having kind of a break. And that's something that I really kind of enjoyed for a good part of that too. Just having, more time. You don't realize sometimes how much time gets sucked up, and again, time for family, time for other projects, so to speak, right? And so that's kind of, it taught me too. I think at that same time, I was kind of learning that I needed to do better with my time anyways. And in terms of my kind of work-life balance and that really kind of set me in place. And and I think I've carried that forward, so to speak, in the last, kind of even since getting back into, right, more normal again, life, so to speak. And kind of taking that as a lesson as I plan kind of my time going forward.
Not to pry too much, and maybe you don't have a clear answer, but is there like one key thing, like, oh, now I do this where I didn't before?
I don't know if there's one key thing. I think it's just finding more leisure time. I guess it's right. In all fairness, I enjoy various sports. I enjoy fishing and just finding time or making more time for those kind of things is, I think, hugely important. And that's something that, I guess that comes with age too. I think just being able to recognize that need to, then, that we don't need to be working 24 hours a day either. That,
Okay. Speaking of working, I guess we should get down to business. So one thing that you're really known for, I think, is, well, I guess I think of you as like the linchpin sort of linking the animal behavior world to sort of the nutrition world, which I think is a really important spot to be in. So you've been really a leader in understanding how dairy cow behavior relates to feeding management. And certainly, I'm sure to you, it maybe starts to sound repetitive, but lots of farms or consultants that I talk to, the topic of dealing with, timeliness of feeding and feed push-ups and stuff is always top of mind because of the turnover in staff and just things get busy. So do you have a kind of a basic summary of your research in this space? Is there like certain number of push-ups per day? Is there a key benefit for feed intake, or is it just making sure cows can access the feed?
Yeah, no, yeah, loaded question, and kind of a summary of work we've done for many years. And it's funny you kind of put it in those terms too, right? Because sometimes I get asked to speak about or write about the subject area, and I'm going, well, we've been working on this for so many years. Like, I keep saying the same thing over and over, but people keep wanting to hear it, right? And so it's a question of, well, why is that, right? Is it just because it is that important, or we still don't do a good enough job, right? And I think there's probably elements of both of those things going on there. And then from a practical standpoint, yeah, I even teach that to the students often. I'm involved in the Dairy Challenge program, and so part of that we train students to look for opportunities on farm often, right? And from a nutritional standpoint, there's sometimes the students look at diets and they get really into the nitty gritty of things and think, oh, maybe we've got to tweak this or this, and then you kind of get them to step back and take a bigger picture and go, well, are the cows actually eating the feed that we're putting in front of them, right? And then are they actually accessing the feed, right? Is that feed actually there for them to eat, right? And that's not only an exercise in education sometimes, but it's even just on farm, right? When I talk to a lot of consulting nutritionists, right, who they can get sometimes 5-10 pounds of milk overnight on farms just by making sure the cows have feed.
Yes.
And so again, it sounds kind of like a simple thing, but in reality, it's not necessarily that case. And I think, the reason, well, we know that, cows eat for various reasons, right? We think they eat to meet their requirement, and there's elements to that, right? And that's, we take advantage of that from a production standpoint. And so, and we want to optimize that. We want to, we want to maximize efficiency, but part of that is also just maximizing the amount of nutrients in so we can get the most nutrients out of those animals. And so we need to think about, well, what drives that kind of nutrient intake, so to speak, right? And I guess my first thesis is always, we want that to be internally driven in cows, right? Like, we don't want a cow to go eat because she's been out of feed for so long that she's hungry and she needs to eat now, right?
Sure.
No, we want cows to be internally hungry. We want her metabolism and basically her body's ability to empty the rumen and clear metabolites quickly so that she has that signaling wherever it's coming from the rumen, from the liver, right, to the brain saying, now it's time to eat again, right? Like, I'm hungry, I got to go eat. And so we want that internally driven. And then when she goes to the feed bunk, we want that feed there. And that's where we run into the issue there, is sometimes our feeding management doesn't match that, right? And so ensuring that feed is there so that, the cow is going to eat when she goes there. And then also that she eats a consistent diet. And that's the other kind of reason why we push up feed, is not only ensuring, say, feed is there, but then making sure as those cows, eat that diet and they sort through it, which again is a behavior that they do on a TMR. We want to make sure that feed gets, turned over and mixed too and kept fresh, so to speak, for those animals as well. So that, again, they're going to be eating not only consistently in time, but also consistent in composition, so to speak.
Absolutely. One thing that came to mind when you were talking is something that we've been spending a little bit of time on this idea that at least some cows and herds are really rigid in where they want to eat. And I'm curious if you've actually seen this in research data, but we have lots of anecdotal stories about watching a cow that's maybe colored a certain way, so it's easy to keep track of where, going up to the feed bunk, apparently looking for a meal, and then that little spot of the bunk is empty, and so just kind of shrugging and going back to her bed and giving up, as opposed to walking, 3 meters down the feed line.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a real thing?
Well, yeah, no, it is a real thing. Quantifying who those are and why is a whole other issue, right? Like,
Yeah.
Again, lots of great anecdotes, right? Like, if you ever walk down a feed bunk too, either a rail or headlocks, and you see like like an opening for people to walk through or whatever, right? Like, where it's usually a little wider. You'll often see like the biggest, bossiest looking cow standing in that spot, right? And again, right, like she's defined that as her spot. And that was actually a former colleague of mine who's since passed away, but he always made that anecdote, right? He'd walk into a barn and he's like, yeah, you find that spot, you're going to find the boss cow standing kind of there, right? And you see that in other cases too, right? Like there's certain cows, as we advance with technology and we can track animal position in the barn, for example, you'll see that some cows stick to certain areas, whereas some cows will graze, so to speak, the whole bunk, versus those cows that may stay in certain spots. And maybe, yeah, if there's not feed available, and that's again comes back to that feeding management thing. If that feed's not distributed well, we're not monitoring that, maybe that feed is sorted through in that area, then the nutrition of that animal who wants to eat in that certain spot might be compromised. Again, a lot of this is, stuff visually we've kind of noticed, and as you alluded to as well, the actual quantification of that it's coming, right? As we kind of develop some of these technologies that allow us to do that too, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of look at that. Now, it comes back to often then, and that's another area of research that we are working in, is looking at kind of how individual cows vary depending on their behavioral profile. Right. And so not every cow, even though we often, group cows that are of similar age, production, all these kind of things, doesn't mean that they're all going to behave the same. And we know that. In fact, we know that cows have behavioral profiles, or even what we call personalities, right? There's cows that are more bold versus more shy, those that are more explorative, right? And so all those kind of things, just like you and I, so to speak, that's going to determine how we interact and our behavior in general. We know that from an animal perspective, those cows will do the same, and it's going to have an impact on when they eat, where they eat, where they stand in a group. All those kind of things are determined by that. And so that's, again, an area that we've been particularly interested in, because we get caught up on mean responses on cows and research often, and we fail to kind of look at the variability around things sometimes, right?
Yep.
And so why is it that you have cows on this end versus this end, and what's the difference between those animals, right? And a lot of times, or in many cases, it's their behavior that's influencing some of that variation.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing your insights there. That's kind of things we've been thinking about too. Okay, so when you work with farms, the old joke is that if you're a professor, the answer to every single question is it depends, right? And so that's because it's usually the right answer. But I'm sure you get asked,
or we need more research, right?
Yeah. But I'm sure you get asked, okay, tell me how many times per day I need to push up feed. Like, how do you answer that typically? Or are there certain factors that help you determine what's a good number for a farm?
Yeah. So the answer is, it depends. But I guess my cheeky answer, so to speak, is and it goes back to the statement I was making earlier about what drives a cow to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And my answer would be, I want to do that as often as I need to, so that the cows don't respond to it.
Oh, okay.
Right. So if I push up feed at any time and one cow is stimulated because of that, that means that right? Maybe for that one cow, there wasn't feed in the spot that she wanted to eat at, or right, or as a group of cows, there just wasn't feed available to them or within reach for those animals. And so that's kind of my general statement would be, yeah, like we want to do that as often as it takes so that the cows don't necessarily respond. The feed is there when the cow is hungry and goes up and wants to eat and have that next meal. And so, yeah, that's then the question is, well, what's going to determine that, right? And so, again, things like how often we're delivering fresh feed to the cows is going to come into play there, right? So potentially the more often we feed per day, like we feed once versus twice, or we get into more often feeding, which we're starting to see a little bit with automation and things like that as well, potentially that doesn't have to happen as much. Still needs to happen because even in those cases, you still could have an empty bunk. And that's a situation that we don't want because, yeah, that cow gets up, she goes to the bunk, there should be feed there for her. How sortable the diet is, right? So a diet that's more sortable, we probably want to be pushing up more often because, and this is where sometimes, yeah, we've got dry cow diets that are often more sortable than lactating diets. And our facilities are sometimes lacking for dry cows, right? That's kind of, right? We prioritize our facilities often like our milking cows and our dry cows and our probably calves in between there and that, right?
Yep.
Down to the heifers. And then even management of feeding, right? Like how many farms, even bigger farms, that they're feeding dry cows still every second day, or right? And not pushing up feed as often, right? And paying attention. But those diets, in many respects, can be more sortable. We often include certain specialty ingredients in them that we want to ensure cows are eating to a certain level. And again, if the management of the feed is not good, we're not going to achieve kind of those outcomes. And then the big one that comes into play there too is stocking density at the feed bunk too, right? And pen densities. And so in a barn that's at 100% stocking density, well, it's important, but a barn that's overcrowded, where we know that those cows are going to be competing for access, they're not necessarily all going to get to the bunk, say, right after they come out of the parlor or whatever time of day it is, maybe that fresh feed was delivered, becomes that much more important for when kind of, let's say, wave 2 of cows come to the bunk, that we make sure that feed is there and again is pushed up. And so in those cases, and having a feed first push up quickly after the first delivery of feed is more important, probably within a half an hour to an hour of getting that feed back pushed in for those animals, and then doing that on a regular basis. And I think functionally for most farms, we're probably looking at least every couple hours of the day. Some farms it's potentially even on the hour throughout the day, right? Where we could see benefit from that. And again, it varies, and that's going to vary by, and you got to pick your battles too, right? On kind of farm size and labor dynamics and all those kind of things too, right? Where if we've got large farms where we've got things happening 24 hours per day, we've got labor on site 24 hours per day, then that becomes much more easy to operationalize. If we're small to medium-sized farm where, maybe we're still milking 2x, we don't have people in the barn necessarily between 9, 10 at night and 4 in the morning kind of thing, then those feeding management things become more important, and that's where automation then can play a bigger role in those scenarios as well. Not only in those smaller farms, but also in the bigger farms there too. So.
Yeah. Let me step back and dig into one comment you made for a second. You said, I like this. You said that you need to push up as many times as necessary to where the cows are not responding. So I used to think of one of the benefits of additional push-ups as being sort of a Pavlovian response of like, oh, when this comes through, it's like the bell and the dog knows he's going to get food, so he can, starts drooling. But thinking through what you're saying, I guess your point might be that if an animal is entrained to come to the bunk in a Pavlovian manner when the push-up goes by, that means at some point she was coming to the bunk and there was no feed until that came. Like she had to get trained that way in some point, right? Is that kind of the way you'd say it?
Yeah, I would say that. And again, I question, because people do make those comments, or they say, oh yeah, we've got a bell on the tractor or on the skid steer or whatever, right? Or a light's flashing or whatever it might be, kind of thing, and the cows respond to that. And yeah, you're correct in that. Yeah, to be trained in that, they would have had to have kind of the stimulus or lack of stimulus, so to speak, right? To learn that response. And then the question is, yeah, does that get retained, truly retained in those animals? And it goes back to actually a study I did in my PhD. We were looking at timing of feed delivery. And so we did a study where we took cows that were milked twice a day and we fed them twice a day, delivered new TMR, either at milking time or actually I pushed it, so basically on a 12-hour kind of interval, or pushed it forward by 6 hours. So the cows are milking at about 6 a.m., 6 p.m. We either fed them at those times, or we had other groups of cows that we still milked at those times, but we fed them at 12 noon and 12 a.m., so midnight. And it was interesting because when we started the trial, we had a couple groups. These are freestyle groups on the one treatment, a couple groups on the other. I went in the barn in the middle of the night to 12 a.m. and I think there was lights on in the alley or something like that. But the tractor was parked down the alley with the mixer wagon, and I was given the job. I was a grad student, and I guess the farm staff didn't want to be there delivering feed, so I started up the tractor to deliver feed. And the first night or two nights, maybe, like I started out the tractor and like that side of the barn, or maybe even the whole barn, like everybody jumped on their feet, kind of thing, right?
Okay, yeah.
And it was like, okay, yeah, right. Like these cows know what's coming and what's happening, right? But yeah, I drove down the alley and just delivered feed to 2 pens, and there was 2 other pens that weren't on my treatment, right? And they didn't get fresh feed, even though a bunch of them had jumped up. And then I parked the tractor down the alley and turned it off for the night, kind of thing. And that happened for 2 or 3 nights. But after, and I don't remember exactly, but probably 3 or 4 nights, I started up the tractor, boom, only the 2 groups that were getting fed jumped up. Nobody else jumped up. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So they know, right? Like in that case, right? Yeah, they learn very quickly, or associated, right? Like based on, again, we do know they can, yeah, they have internal clocks, so to speak, right? And so they could figure out that, yeah, that was their time, so to speak, right? And so again, whether or not that's necessarily a good thing in that case, right? Is another kind of question, right? So we do have that opportunity, but the question then becomes is that necessarily a good thing, and does it get retained over long periods either, right? So
right.
I would say if there's no reward, right? If the stimulus is there but there's no reward, then that behavior is not going to be retained. And so in the case of like the feed push-up, for example, if they're chronically low on feed and that feed push-up does bring it back, and right, then that, so to speak, reward is there, and that may remain imprinted on that animal. But if we're actually doing a good job of making sure feed's there all the time, then there's not really a need for that, so to speak. And going back to what I said earlier, like I really want, because at the end of the day, the ability of that animal to put more nutrients into her body is going to be limited by basically the outflow of nutrients from the rumen of that cow, as well as the speed at which she clears the end products of those digestion, right, from her body or internally. So it doesn't really matter what kind of external stimuli we create if she can't balance that off with that kind of internal motivation to eat, right?
Right.
So that's where feed quality comes into play, right? We think of forage quality and we think about that from an efficiency and just total nutrient capture standpoint, but it actually comes back to, especially in a ruminant, right? Like the quicker she can digest forages, the quicker she's going to be able to put more into her, right? So that's kind of the short and simple of that.
Great. So you kind of started down this road too, and I wanted to come back to that now. The whole question of whether automation to sort of manage push-ups at a minimum makes sense. And, I've seen some pretty solid analyses on returns to investment in robotic milking or automatic milking systems. I'm not sure I've ever seen that for these sort of push-up systems. The investment is much smaller, but, probably the impact on the farm is smaller too. And of course, there's a lot more automation in Canada than the US. So I'm curious, you've probably been on lots of farms that use these. What is your take? Have you done an analysis? Do you have a sense that people are investing in those still, or are people moving away from it?
No, yeah, that's a good question. Interestingly, we see more adoption of that kind of technology with other technology, right? So, So within, say, those that are adopting robotic milking technology, we see a high proportion of those adopting feeding technologies too. We did a survey study which we published last year, I guess, and of almost 200 robot farms in Canada, and about 70% of those were also using robotic feed pushers.
Okay, I didn't know that number.
So it was pretty high, right? And interesting, and kind of going back to your questions about that, like within that, we saw even added benefit of like more feed push-ups, right, within those herds. Yep. So it's not just the technology, it's the frequency, some kind of combination. There's some U.S. data that I often quote too, showing difference in milk production. This was a study that came out of Dr. Marcia Andrus's group in Minnesota, like showing a difference in milk between herds. These are robot herds, again, pushing up feed robotically versus not. And there's a huge number. And the point I always make is it's not the robot that's so magical. It's the fact that probably the herds that weren't using a robot were just doing a really bad job, right?
Yeah, it's more a study of the type of farm manager that would invest in a robot, or sometimes it's confounded, right? It's
again, in those cases, right? Like if these are maybe smaller, medium-sized robot farms, they don't have people there 24 hours a day. There's likely the bunks, if they're not using a robot feed pusher, that bunk's going empty. If I'm a large dairy, and like I was alluding to earlier, I've got people there 24 hours a day, I can have an employee whose job it is to push up feed every hour or whatever it is, then yeah, the robotic feed pusher itself isn't going to do anything different other than potentially save labor and do so more consistently. And I think that's where the technology pays, right? Is it can do something more frequently, which can have benefit, but the consistency and the fact that, again, as long as the technology is good and doesn't break down, right? But even on large dairy sometimes, right, the person who's responsible for pushing up feed might also be responsible for walking just-in-time calving or whatever it might be, right? And or they get distracted with something, or someone needs their help with something, and so the job doesn't necessarily get done as consistently as we'd like, and that's where technology can really come into play, is that it can replace that. So that's where, interestingly, when we've looked at, say, feed push-up technology or feed push-up frequency, like in a controlled study design, we don't necessarily always see the benefits. But when we look at the data in field studies, that's where we start to see benefits. And I think it's because there's often in field studies, it's the compounding of other sources of variation.
Yes.
Both measured and unmeasured. So sometimes we're able to capture some of that. We try to control for that. But sometimes there's other forms of variability, or like you were alluding to, management differences even, right? That are going to influence the outcome on those farms. And so I think that's where we start to see that benefit. And so, in terms of I haven't seen an exact cost benefit analysis, so to speak, other than what's provided commercially by various companies, right, that might be selling the equipment. They're probably willing to do that, but from a researcher kind of publicly available standpoint, I haven't really seen that. But I would argue that we have enough evidence from research that we've done, both again on commercial farms as well as in controlled studies, that we can point to the potential benefit. And it comes back to like, does the cost of labor as well as the consistency at which that labor can be done, does that balance off with the cost of the technology?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that kind of got us into a little bit of talking about robotic milking. And I know, again, we've already alluded to the fact that the adoption rate is much greater in Canada than the U.S. And people like yourself and Greg Penner and others in Canada have, I think, been making the biggest strides in helping us understand how to handle nutrition on robotic farms. And in the U.S., we've been looking to you guys for insights. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're working on right now around questions like that?
Yeah, no, and it's a whole new world again. I would say from a nutritional management standpoint, right? Like we got nutrition on dairy farms, I would say fairly dialed in, right, with TMR, group level feeding. Again, breaking that down by production group, by parity group, all these kind of things. We could be fairly efficient feeding at a group level and do so fairly consistently. And the challenge with the robot is, that does get thrown into a little bit of a challenge, so to speak, because we're taking a certain proportion of that diet and putting it in the robot, and now there's positive and negatives associated with that, right?
Yes.
The positive is that we have the opportunity to potentially feed that cow a little bit more. We use the word precisely, but we should be saying accurately, right, to her needs, and then also and then we want precision on top of that, right? We want to do that consistently, and the question is, can we do that? And we have challenges associated with that, and so that remains one big area that we continue to work on is trying to understand our ability to be able to do that, to target the individual animal, because again, if we're going to be feeding that cow in that robot, it comes back to not only knowing her needs and getting the right nutrients into the right cows at the right time, so to speak. That hinges or functions on her actually going there and eating the feed that we give to her, right? We can't guarantee that in all situations. So going back to kind of our earlier discussion on cow behavior, so that's one of the focuses of my group right now, is looking at how individual cows differ from a behavioral standpoint, and whether or not all cows kind of behave the same if we give them all the same feeding strategy, and we realize at the end of the day they don't. And so that becomes a challenge for us to overcome. Is there certain types of behavioral patterns that are better, right? And I actually gave a presentation on this recently where there was dairy producers in the audience, and dairy farmer came up to me after, who milks with robots, and said to me, I'd love to be able to determine which cows are going to be, right, like my non-problem cows,
yes,
right, based on her genetics, right? So, and we just did a kind of a pilot study on that this past summer. One of my former students, looking at just how heritable some of those traits might be, even as well. Just scratching the surface, but I think we know there is some heritability of behavior, and so can we take advantage of some of that from that perspective? And so that's kind of where we're thinking, or where we're kind of moving in this direction. And then just beyond looking at that broadly too, like, can we do a better job, as I mentioned before, in terms of getting the right nutrients into the right cows at the right time? So do we understand well enough how do we increase energy, nutrient supply in early lactation, right? To get cows through the transition period, keep them healthy, get good peaks out of those cows, good persistency. And then on the tail end of that, do we also understand the end of lactation too, that we don't oversupply, we manage body condition on those cows well. And those are still real challenges that we have when it comes to feeding cows in robots. And one of the big challenges, and it kind of goes back to where I started, was saying we had kind of TMR feeding dialed in, is that when you go out in the field now and let's say you survey 10 different robot farms, and I see that in Canada, but I also see that in the US. I was in Europe recently and I saw the same thing. The feeding practices are different on all those farms.
All over the board, aren't they? Yeah.
All over the board.
Yeah.
And there's not necessarily a correlation between one approach and necessarily a good outcome, right?
Yeah.
So you could have two farms that are performing very similarly, high level of milk production, good visits per day. They've got two totally different barn setups, traffic scenarios even, two totally different feeding approaches in the robot, right? Different types of feeds. And there doesn't seem to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's where there's still some frustration, because we got used to kind of almost a one-size-fits-all approach. And
a lot of accepted knowledge, on the TMR system after 50, 80 years, right?
Yeah. And we've had to kind of back away from that and go, no, that's not necessarily the case, right? And that's a challenge from an application standpoint. It's a challenge from a research, because again, a lot of the research that we're doing too becomes very situational specific.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like my facility is designed different than, you mentioned, Dr. Greg Penner, right, in Saskatchewan, and Greg's facility is different than ours, right? And so even though we might run the same trial, we might not get the same results, right? Because of the way the facility is designed and the way the cows are directed to the robot, or all these kind of things, and that's what we see in the field too. So
they said a lot of job security, right, for research.
Well, that's, again, like from that research perspective, that's exciting, right?
Yeah. Are there any other newer dairy farm technologies that you're looking into?
Well, I guess there's things I have interest in that we're giving more thought to, and one of those is kind of integration of technology. So we do have a lot of technologies, and so with the robots, right? We talked about how do we do a better job there, right? Like, can we incorporate more than just knowing the production level of the cow, or even her days in milk, right? Is there other attributes of that cow that we can incorporate in terms of our prediction models? Again, we know that we can predict dry matter intake and milk production based on other things in cows, right? So body weights, body condition scores, right? Are we using that information? Some of that information we are able to capture automatically on farm now already.
Yep.
And so can we actually use that information, right? Milk spectral analysis, right? So fatty acid composition, there's some new papers coming out on that, right? Looking at whether or not we can use that information potentially to predict changes in cows, and then use that as kind of in a feedback loop to the nutrition of those animals as well. And so I think that's where we're moving. The information's there in a lot of cases. It's a matter of finding out how do we model that, and then how do we incorporate that into our the software, et cetera, that are needed in these systems. And then I think probably again from a monitoring standpoint, one area that kind of excites me is the whole computer vision area. We've seen a lot of development of that in the last few years. Still got a ways to go, but I've been really keen for years on monitoring cow behavior, right? Sensor technology, collars, right? Leg-based sensors, all these kind of things. The thing that excites me about the computer vision stuff is that I think a lot of that can be replaced with computer vision, right? Yeah. Like we could have a one-stop kind of system, right? That monitors cow behavior, monitors the facilities, monitors the people, right? Mm-hmm. Monitors the feed. All those kind of things could be done under one umbrella, and we can use that to be proactive and reactive, right? So we can use that for decision making, to be preventative, so to speak, or to correct issues. And we can also then be reactive in terms of monitoring cows. We can use it for reproduction, all those kind of things. And so I think if someone could develop that and that system like that does it all, then that's where I see the industry moving. Now, a lot of companies are in that space right now, and they're all working on their own kind of niches. But putting it all together, I think, is where the industry needs to get to.
Great. It'll be exciting to see what we can do in 10 years in that space, I think. Okay. As we approach the end here, we've got 3 questions we throw at every one of our guests, and it's fascinating for me to hear the different answers. First question, what's your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
Good question. I don't know if I can answer that with one thing, because I think it depends on the form of media, I'd say, so to speak, right? Like, I'd say my go-to, and I think we've heard it actually in these podcasts already, like my go-to book, and it's sitting on the shelf behind me there, is my old Van Soos Nutritional Ecology of the Ruminant. Like, that's, like, it goes back to, I inherited that from my initial graduate advisor, and like, if I still want to learn something today, right, that I open that up and read about, different aspects of the rumen, or microbes or whatever it might be, right, that I think the first edition came out, and I think it was 82 or something like that, right? So, so that'd be my go-to there. But yeah, kind of more modern day, so to speak, resource, I would say, from an academic standpoint, I'm still kind of geeked out, I guess, when it comes to the Journal of Dairy Science. Like, when I get my monthly alert, I open that up and I
scan through it,
scan the table of contents, looking for papers I want to read and things that excite me. So, and then beyond that, like just trade magazines still excite me, right? Seeing different articles, and then the particularly in the last few years, like podcasts like this and other online webinar platforms, like different podcast platforms. Again, they all excite me, and I like to listen to them. It's just a matter of finding time. That's always the challenge, right?
Although it's better to be in this area where you're excited and wish you could do more than to be bored, right?
Yeah.
All right, what's your favorite book or resource outside of ag?
Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting one, because I outside of work, and I have to admit, like, I don't read much fiction, nonfiction. Like, I'll pick up the odd fiction book when I'm on vacation, right? And I'm really relaxed, I guess, and I've kind of thrown everything to the wind, so to speak. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know. Like, I'm not one to kind of read nonfiction kind of books to guide my life or anything like that, or my viewpoints on life. I'd say most of that's kind of based in my faith, and probably my Bible, right? That's where I get my guidance from that perspective. On the entertainment side of things, like I said, I read a little bit here and there, but then I like my my outdoor kind of enthusiast type channels on social media, and that's I guess my downtime kind of thing, or my brain goes in my downtime.
Your mental health break. All right, last question then. In your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those that are less successful?
And when you refer to dairy professionals, is that like all levels within the industry, or all categories, I guess?
Yeah, I think, but take it however you want.
Yeah, I know that's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that set people apart, right? Attributes that come to mind are people who are passionate about the industry, and kind of, all levels, right? So from the ground up, like I think of people like ourselves who are in academia, right? Those that are, connected and passionate, right, from kind of ground level up to kind of the higher levels of science that we might be involved with, right? And you see the same thing kind of work through, right? Like if you speak to people working directly as dairy kind of industry professionals, whether in consultative roles or nutritionists, veterinarians, and then dairy producers themselves. Like, you see that those that I think are quote unquote most professional and are the ones that are connected through kind of right from ground level on the farm right up to some of the higher level things that we're trying to achieve from a research and development standpoint. And then part of that too is not necessarily, and I think that goes with a lot of things in life, but like not necessarily too inward looking either, right? Always kind of looking outside, not scared of development and change, and open to new ideas. And I think that's where you see kind of the most progressive people, right? And progressive, professional, whatever you might want to call it, right? So
great answer. Agree with you. All right, Trevor, as always, very enjoyable conversation. Thank you for your time. I know it's valuable, but I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the invite. It was a pleasure. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
So with that, we'll sign off another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it, and we'll see you next time.